Now, please join me in welcoming Tina Brown and Madalika C.
Well, I love this book. As you can see, I read it very closely. It was really fun. Now, as you heard Brad say, Tina is the legendary magazine editor turning around storied publications in her career. She's from Britain, as you know, as am I, and I've been aware of her for a very long time, from the very early days of her time at Tatler. And when I came to America, I, of course, subscribed to Vanity Fair that she ran. Now, what you know about Tina is the things you've heard. She's incredibly smart, successful, high-charging. So you won't be surprised that she writes in the introduction to the book that when she was in high school, she committed what she describes as crimes of attitude, which meant that she didn't always stay in those schools, but still managed to get herself to Oxford and become the young editor of the Tatler, and then she came to conquer New York. So you might be surprised to hear that she wrote in her diary, when she arrived in New York, very successful, she landed in New York, quote, brimming with fear and insecurity. My London bravado began to evaporate. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, can you all hear me? Yes. It's very exciting to be here in this amazing new store. Brad, thank you so much. It feels, it's vibrating with newness and a sense that this is a happening place to be. So thank you so much for having me in this new store. It's wonderful. And to be with Madalika, who is someone I admire enormously from her NPR days, and she's a great tastemaker herself, so thank you for that. Well, my bravado evaporated because, I thought I was in the capital of the world, in London, thrumming London, Mrs. Thatcher's London, as it was when I was editing Tatler, and we had a little team of sort of insurgent editors and writers, and we made Tatler, in our terms, very successful. We took it from 10,000 to 100,000, and it was bought by mighty Condé Nast. But then, when I heard that Vanity Fair was launching and I started to become, romantically interested in it, I had to arrive in New York, called over as I was to be a consultant at first before I became editor. It just, the hugeness of New York, the materialism of New York. I was struck so much by the wealth, by the pace. It was so overwhelming. And yet at the same time, very exciting because, I've always been, a woman of the arena, if you like, and I wanted to be in the big time, and New York was the big time. That's where I wanted to be.
You have a very funny story about what you were listening to on the radio in the cab on the night you arrived that introduced you to an America that you probably wouldn't hear the same kind of thing in Britain at that time, at any rate.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I get off the plane, British Airways, and I get into this cab, and I start bumping along, looking at the skyscrapers, fantasizing about being Dorothy Parker, and suddenly I hear a very strange, rasping voice coming out of the front, which the cabbie's listening to, and talking about the most outrageous sexual things on the radio. It went on and on, and I'm thinking, what is the hell is he listening to? Turns out I ask him, and he says, it's Dr. Ruth, he says. So this is my introduction to New York City, which is like, it's definitely a new frontier, not the BBC, not Radio 4, I can tell you that.
Well, you describe, first I have to ask you about the diaries, because you wrote diaries. I saw you on CBS the other day. There are these old school notebooks. And I have to say, after reading this book, I was exhausted just reading it. How did you find time to write diaries, and why did you want to? Had you always been writing diaries?
Well, I've always been a diarist, yeah. I started writing diaries at 10, and I think that you either are, you either have that need to write. I guess it's because I have a writer's temperament, and I'm a kind of born reporter. And I began to feel, the more I kept my diary, that a day unrecorded was a day spent asleep in a funny way, that unless one had recorded it, there was no point in having lived it. So that became a very sort of deep feeling for me, and I used to come in home full of my observations, and I felt the need to unload them. Diaries are also very therapeutic. They actually help you organize your thoughts. When I first came to New York, my husband was working in Washington, Everything was new. Everything was coming at me with such velocity. Writing the diary became a way to sort of calm myself and sort it out in my mind. And by the time I'd written an entry, I felt sort of the day had reached some closure. So it was a sort of a need. And I kept it voluminous in those days because I think, first of all, I didn't have children for the first 2 years. So, I didn't have, as I later got to be, this crazy juggling act that we all do. And also my husband was working away, as I said, and, it was pre-digital, so there wasn't as much to do. And I used to come home, watch a bit of TV, and then I would write my diary.
Well, they're full of wonderful observations, which we'll get to. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the courtship with Vanity Fair. You were a consultant. It was clear that wasn't going to work, and there needed to be a new editor. Just talk about that, because you talk about a little bit about your fear of being eaten alive in New York, which for those of us who know you now, I think is sort of a quaint thing to think about, because I think
30.
you're up for everyone. And that's what is also amazing. You're a young woman dealing with, frankly, a lot of old men.
Yeah, certainly. Well, what else was there? In fact, when I saw the CBS clip, I was amused to see myself, age 30, presenting the magazine to the whole of the Condé Nast management, and they are all white men, all around the table, and I didn't even notice it at the time. It was
Plus ça change.
Yeah, plus ça change. It was just the way the world looked, the way the world still looks. But I was brought in because it had 2 editors in 9 months. They launched Vanity Fair again in 1984, brought it back from the dead in the 1930s when it closed. Cy Newhouse, who had recently taken over his inheritance at Condé Nast, wanted to now have world domination in magazines. He wanted to bring back Vanity Fair and launch things, and he eventually bought The New Yorker. So he was in the kind of very expansionist mood. So with a great deal of hype and fanfare and glamour that hadn't yet happened, they launched Vanity Fair. And they hired an editor. And unfortunately, after all the hype, which so often happens with hype, it was, alas, a turkey. It just died, and it became an object of derision. So they had to get rid of him. And first of all, they looked around, they didn't have anybody. I had just been editing Tatler, which they just bought. They thought maybe I could come in and sort of help and bring in the old editor at Vogue, the features editor, who was about 75 and who was an in-house person. They would give him the editorship, and I would be the sort of young, buzzy consultant who could help him. So I arrived to help old Leo Lerman. Unfortunately, as I recount, Leo Lerman was wildly threatened by me, completely hostile to me. He wanted nothing to do with me. But it was a bit like being at summer school before term starts, You were able to actually see everybody in the office, get to know everybody. And I gradually began to realize, because first of all, they'd said to me, would you like to do the job? And I had sort of run away. I was scared. I thought it was too much. New York was scary. My husband was still in England. So I said, I'll be this consultant. And I came in and I began to realize I wimped out. I completely wimped out. I should be the editor of this magazine. These people cannot do it. This guy is like, everything out of his mouth is some piece of received wisdom. The ideas of the stories are completely old. Everybody around him just, is just giggling. And, when they're not in his office, this is ridiculous. I can do this job. So at the end of 3 months, I realized this wasn't going to work. And so Cy Newhouse called me up and he said to me, why don't you stay? Why are you going back to England? And I said, well, I don't want to do anything except edit this magazine. And if you want to give me the editorship, I can do this magazine, and I'm going to go back to London now. And off I went. Very cocky behavior when you think about it. I was 30 years old. I mean, what did I get off, really, saying to the chairman of Condé Nast, either it's the editorship, it's my way or the highway. But I think when you're young, you're sort of brazen and you kind of think you can do things. And so I leapt on a plane back to London, and then I sat there sort of fretting, for the next 3 or 4 months that I'd blown it, that in fact I'd been, overplayed my hand. But they came back and they asked me to do it. And then my adventures in the diary begin.
Well, I think we could all take a lesson from being as cocky as that. Now, I'm really interested in reading the diary and sort of the way you think about magazines. You obviously love magazines. It's sort of in your soul. But I love the way that you think about what were they like before and how you study, these magazines earlier on, which you also did with The New Yorker. And I wanted you to talk a bit about the things that you wanted to bring to Vanity Fair, and the thing that I think was the signature that you brought in particular, extraordinary, well-reported writing. But I think, people put premium on words in a magazine, as you did. But I think you sort of saw the not yet fully realized potential of non-news photos.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because you developed, amazing relationships with Annie Leibovitz and Harry Benson and Brits, and those photos from that period are still iconic. So talk about that part of what you wanted to do with Vanity Fair.
Well, I think being a magazine editor is definitely a twofold skill set. I mean, I think you need to be, obviously, somebody who cares enormously about words, but pictures are really important too. And I sometimes, have said to people, being an editor is not about a bunch of very good articles with a staple through it. You can have 6 amazing articles which do not make a good magazine when you see the whole together. It's really the way the pieces play off one another and the way the visuals pace the magazine, and how you want to go from a wonderfully dynamic, sort of striking portrait of somebody, who's the most kind of elegant and beautiful, and then you turn into something that's gritty and reported, and a photograph that's perhaps by a war photographer like a Don McCullen or someone of that ilk, so that you have this kind of marvelous sense of constantly being stopped in your track by a new kind of a visual taste thing that happens to you as you read. I think that the actual pagination of a magazine is terribly important. How you choose to lay it out in terms of both the design, which I always favor as a very strong, clean, unfussy thing. I don't like magazines that are a riot of type. I don't like fancy typefaces. And I mean, there's certain magazines, I look at them now, they're so badly designed. There's a great piece there, but you can't find it or see it. It's just all over-designed, over-art directed. I've always liked that very strong, clean, classical design with strong, clean headlines, which make the photographs breathe and live. And you want to have a combination of high and low and pleasure and challenge and all of those things that make you constantly keep turning the page and not want to put it down. And it is a kind of a feel that you developed. It's very much like putting on a show, in the same way you want to have a star who opens, and then you go to the second act and you have some humor and you have some escapist joy. So that's really how I always thought about magazines, was that kind of array of content that played off each other.
And it was a crazy time, that period of the 80s, the Reagan heyday, a lot of wealth and just status and the world that you encountered and wrote about and were a part of, but were also observing. And I was really struck by how you're almost conflicted by it. The part of you that just wants to curl up at the duvet and a good book of poetry, and then the need to be out there and be part of it. Just talk a little bit about that just pace, which is dizzying, and it just seems so, that world was such a bubble.
It was a bubble, but I feel that an editor has to an editor's job is to sort of reflect, explain, predict the sort of front edge of the culture, if you like. And the Reagan years were extremely affluent for those in that echelon of society, while at the other end, of course, there were many people who were feeling the downside of all of that, mad spending bubble that was going on one level of society. There was a whole bunch of people who were not feeling that. And actually, the undertow of the darker side is also running through the book with the AIDS epidemic and the sense that this is all so precarious and also, in a way, decadent, actually, at the time. But I also found it wonderful material, and the stuff literally of Thackeray's Vanity Fair. I mean, that's what we were doing. So it required the people who could chronicle that. And I discovered a film producer who was down on his luck, who turned out to be Dominic Dunn, who had an extraordinary voice, and I kind of suggested that he keep a diary and that he start doing magazine pieces. And it turned out that Dominic Dunn was the absolutely right voice to sort of chronicle that period, because he was, again, both insider, outsider. He was a Hollywood producer. He knew Park Avenue. He was a great sort of socialite on one level. On the other hand, he'd been down on his luck. He was been in AA. He'd seen the downside. He'd been on the skids. It made him a great observer and a great journalist. And of course, he also had the tragedy of his daughter being murdered, which meant that he had a great sense of criminal justice. And he became our sort of crime, social world axis writer, and really sort of helped to define those times, those great trials like the Klaus von Bülow trial and the Menendez brothers, and then later, of course, O.J. Simpson. These were the meat, as a way, that was a fantastic material for Dominic Dunn. And then visually, I took the fashion photographer Helmut Newton, who'd never really done journalism before, and I got Helmut to start photographing these pieces with Dominic so that the two of them would go out as a team. And it created a very sort of sexy combo, actually, the two of them. The sort of high gloss with a kind of dark edge of Helmut, and then this wonderful mellow voice of Nick Dunn, who was the insider-outsider reporter who broke so much news. It was an absolutely golden combo. And then there were others like Marie Brenner and Gail Sheehy, who also brought extraordinary business pieces, political pieces. But you mentioned about the great photographers, and of course, I was so lucky to work with Annie Leibovitz. And when I first arrived at Vanity Fair, when it was all such a big mess, a classic glass cliff situation I came into, I had to go in over the weekend and redesign the magazine, and spent 4 days with the art department just hurling things out, in and out, and like making the new design that we had to do fast before the next issue. And I started to ransack the art department for photographs. I knew there were drawers full of treasures. I just sensed that there must be these photographs that this very profligate magazine had just been assigning, that there's bound to be some great stuff. And lo, what did I find when I opened the drawer in the art department was an unpublished, fantastic portfolio that Annie Leibovitz had done of comedians in every shape and form. I mean, there was Whoopi Goldberg in the famous bath of milk, which became an iconic picture, and there was Pee Wee Herman hanging upside down from a lamp, and there was all of these hilarious pictures of these comedians in different situations. And so I put them all into the magazine and gave it 10 pages, and it was the April issue, so we called it April Fools. And it was absolutely glorious. And that was the sort of beginning of my collaboration with Annie, who was thrilled to have been sort of brought out of obscurity she was very famous at Rolling Stone, then hired by Vanity Fair and had kind of not been used. So this was the beginning of our great collaboration. And we did so many great portfolios, covers, She became the iconic visual definer, really, of Vanity Fair's whole look and feel.
And, I think the other thing you managed so beautifully, it was a very eclectic magazine, because most of us are. We like pop, we like politics, we like literature, and you kind of satisfied all those urges. And that was very distinguishing, I think, about the magazine. But I want to play a little word association with you, because I think that some of the things that there are things that are commented on about you that I think if you were a man, maybe you might not have heard this if you were a man doing exactly what you did to Vanity Fair. So I'm going to quote from the diary. And what I love about this is you're so aware, and you can write this stuff down in the moment. So the word buzz, I think that is probably the word most often associated with Tina. Some people look upon that as a bad thing. I actually think that's a very good thing. But you're right, I'm sick of people writing about the buzz I create with Vanity Fair. Buzz sounds like something grafted on, something fake and manufactured. It's a put down, a dismissal of impact, a way to minimize ability to identify stories people want to read and talk about. They call it buzz, I call it engagement. I feel a nagging sense this buzz bullshit would not keep being said about a male editor. And the fact that you use the word engagement back in the mid-1980s, if you go to any media company now, the only word that people care about is audience engagement.
Right, well, I mean, I never understood why buzz always sounded like, sort of buzz, as if you were kind of this frou-frou merchant who came spinning in on your high heels with the kind of, plates spinning over you. But, it's true. I mean, I believe that if you put out a magazine, your role is to, seduce, fascinate, illuminate. And if you do those three things, people are going to talk about it. Your role as an editor is not to send people to sleep. Your role as an editor is to have people stimulated enough that they talk to each other about it. And if that's buzz, that's what I do. And I hope everybody who puts on a TV show or writes a book want people to be intrigued enough to share it. You know, so it's but it is an interesting thing that those kind of words and you know, words like dishy and perky, and I mean, you know, we all know those words, right?
Yeah, we do. Gossip.
Gossip, yeah.
Gossip is a kind of addiction like overeating or drinking. I think that the stories of the last month have shown us the value of gossip. Every office has had gossip about things that have turned out to be true. So talk about your attitude and your feelings about gossip.
Well, I do agree. I mean, gossip is the way you get a lead, right? I mean, gossip is often true, or certainly has enough of a, you know, a center, a kernel to it that makes you want to follow a story. And as you say, the gossip we've seen about so many people recently has turned out to, in fact, be something much more egregious than what we even knew in the gossip. So I think there's a big value to gossip. I think obviously gossip becomes malign very easily too.
Right.
And, you know, it's endless character assassination and I think, unfortunately, in the sort of digital age, the outlets are so voluminous and multiple that it can also be extremely damaging. So, you know, gossip is a double-edged sword, but gossip should be respected also.
Serious.
Serious.
You talk about, you know, that there was this sort of sense in the media world at the time, well, some people are serious journalists and some outlets are doing serious things, and by definition, that means other outlets are not.
Well, that's also, that's very interesting, actually. I feel strongly coming from London that the European media is far more attuned to the serious being what a person says, not the outlet it necessarily appears in. There's a literary tradition, really, amongst British journalists, actually, of sometimes very high caliber literary people. You know, the Anthony Burgesses or the John le Carrés or those kind of writers who will quite happily write a piece for a tabloid newspaper if the fee's good. They don't feel that they're demeaned by writing in those outlets. I think America's far more sort of a little bit more sort of high-minded and a little more sententious about, you know, this is not appropriate for this august publication. But I've never felt that. I think that a magazine or a periodical really is defined by the seriousness of whatever the contributor is saying, not whether or not it appears next to a photograph of a movie star or, you know, a lighter story. In fact, as a matter of fact, sometimes those other elements can make that piece stand out even more.
That brings me to high-low.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you need the relief when you're reading something of being able to be both light and heavy. You do not want to have, nobody wants a solid diet of gravitas, you know? I mean, you just start to not be able to absorb it. It's much better to have gravitas next to something which also then, you know, freshens the palate, like a sorbet course. So I'm a big believer in high-low. I think it's kind of what everybody really wants, if they're being honest. And I frequently had, it's very interesting when I was editing Vanity Fair, that, you know, very august people at times would say to me, oh, I love the piece on Deborah Winger. You know, and you think, wait a minute, you were supposed to be reading the piece about, you know, Iraq and Gulf War I. You know, that was your piece. Like, why do you like this? But then it would make me smile. I would think I'm so happy because they'd actually gone from the original piece that really was their piece, but then they grazed over to read the Deborah Winger piece, and they found it fun. And the important fact for the reader, I think, is that you do the Deborah Winger piece as well in its own way, you know, as you do the piece on Iraq. That's the important thing. You don't say, here's a really good piece, and here's this piece of crap that's just meant to entertain you. The entertaining piece should really also be as good as it can get in that genre. So we had a lot of very good celebrity writers, actually, who were able to do. Of course, at that time, the PRs were rampant, but they were not as rampant as today. So you had more access, at least, than you do now, although we were always fighting with the PRs, which is quite a theme in the book. We're always
Yes, it is a big theme in the book.
Having huge fights with PRs.
I don't even know how people manage it today, because there are so many outlets.
So controlled.
Yeah, and there are opportunities for people to reach the audience directly.
Correct.
So they don't need the middle person. I want to go back to the 80s because this was clearly a time when there weren't a lot of female leaders in newsrooms. Sadly, as Tina and I were discussing earlier, this is a time now where there aren't a lot of female leaders in newsrooms either. But I wanted you to talk about what it was like. In the diary, you note, most of my role models have been men. They always had the lives I wanted. And you quote Gloria Steinem as saying, "Become the man you want to marry." What was it like being a woman in the 80s in this very high-powered, very male-dominated world where not only were you a woman, but you were young?
Well, I mean, I think, you blaze ahead when you're young, so you notice it a bit less. I noticed it more when I looked back on what I went through, actually, because I think the main thing one had to deal with was just being underestimated all the time, always somewhat, as we were talking, a little dissed in ways that you would not have been had you been a man doing the same thing. But for some ways, I also made that my fuel. I also just sort of, it spurred me on, to want to achieve. I got frustrated, which is another theme in the diary, by somehow feeling that I was always kept out of the business of the magazine. That there was and now when I see that clip and I see all those men sitting around the table, I realize that those instincts were completely correct. I mean, there was no invitation into that world of the big strategic thoughts about the magazine. And yet, I came up with some of them. Obviously, I turned around the magazine. I turned it into a market leader. And in fact, I also had very good ideas. Like I launched the London Vanity Fair with the concept of really making it the same magazine with just a few changes, and selling advertising there, which made it another big profit center. Mm-hmm. Actually, I conceived the idea. I went over there, I promoted it, and I turned it into a great success, which became a real revenue stream. And yet, I would find again and again that I was never discussed about a new publisher of the magazine being hired. I literally would never be asked, what did I think of this person? As if I was completely irrelevant.
How much of that was to do you think, with the times? I mean, we've talked about serious journalism versus others, and I think for the longest time in journalism, there's been this sense that, journalists do not sully themselves with the business. But when you're a newsroom leader, I think you have to. Was that sort of something they didn't want?
It was a bit of that, but I also found that I just couldn't get heard. And I did feel that was very much about being a woman. I mean, when I went to the New Yorker, I had the right ideas completely about what should happen. I mean, at the end of Vanity Fair, I was approached to make it into a TV show, and Newhouse completely blew the idea out. Then I went to the New Yorker, had a fantastic time there for 7.5 years, but at the end of it, I started to feel, I want the New Yorker to be more than just a magazine. It could be a radio show, it can be a book company, it can be, because many a movie producer would approach us for the rights of our stories, and I thought we should actually have our own production company. And I really wanted it to be a much more lateral thing, with the magazine as a sort of center, and then around it an ecosystem of other kinds of media. And this was 1998, and again, Newhouse completely blew me out. He just wasn't interested. And I got so frustrated, I felt, why doesn't he see it? And I did feel somehow, I wanted, if I'd been a male voice saying these things, he wouldn't have been a sort of, don't bother your pretty head about it, just go off and edit the magazine. Please don't bother me with this. And of course, 20 years later, that's what everyone is doing, right? I mean, imagine if we'd done it then. Right. I mean, I remember saying to him, we could be like the HBO of print, and him just looking at me as if I was sort of, she's such a ditz, what a shame, And of course, it's why I left. So to go off and do that.
It's interesting. This is also a time when you became a mother, and some of your staff became mothers too. It was, probably unheard of to have leaders who were mothers as opposed to fathers.
I was the first. It was very funny. The human resources person at Condé Nast is one of the sort of heroes of the book. I absolutely loved her. She was I admired her so much. She was so cool, and she was a real kind of businesswoman like I'd never kind of really seen before in London. And when I told her that I was pregnant, she said, "That's excellent. We can now test our maternity policy here." And I was the first one to have that happen. I was the first kind of editor-in-chief to ever have a child at Condé Nast. And so in that sense, I did sort of break some ground there. But then I hired a lot of my team, or 2 or 3 of my team, also had babies at the same time, and it was wonderful. We developed this kind of secret, kind of little club between us in a way, where we had each other's backs. When my managing editor, who was so critical to the success of the magazine, got pregnant shortly, 6 months before I did or after I did, I can't remember which now, I had this brainwave of asking for my former managing editor at Tatler to come take a sabbatical and come and slip into her job. And it was really the sort of first time anyone had quote, maternity cover, which has really become a sort of a thing here now. Right. It worked brilliantly. She arrived like Mary Poppins with a big bag and her umbrella descended into the job. And of course knew my ways completely. And managing one magazine is not that different from managing another. Within a couple of weeks, I didn't even notice Pam had gone off, even though she was my right hand. And then after 3 months, she flew off on her umbrella back to London. And she came back again when Pam had her second child. And since I left, I then said, Graydon Carter's going to need a Pam. I'm taking Pam, guys. I can't function without Pam, to the New Yorker. And Chris Garrett, as her name is, she's still there. So my maternity cover stayed for 25 years after I left.
I think there are probably a few HR departments who you could talk to, even today. I know we want to have time for questions. I think the book reveals, the challenges of being a working mother. Your son was born prematurely and he had difficulties. And I think something that comes across, which people haven't been talking about, is you're a doting wife and mother. And, you planned your life so that you wouldn't be far away from your child for very long. Yeah. And all these kinds of details, which I think people should take note of, because I think that that's a part of you and who you are and, contributed to your success.
Well, I mean, at one point in the diary I said, and it kind of struck me when I was reading it, people confuse a career with a life, and you shouldn't, because however much I loved my career, and I did. I mean, the book is really a love affair about a career, and a young career. Nonetheless, when I had first Georgie, who had Asperger's, and then Izzy, who's came 5 years later, my world completely changed. And this whole question of how you integrate your child, you have two passions now. You have your work, which was always a passion, but then you have, of course, this bigger other passion, which is your family, and how you can try to integrate those things, and everything always seems a trade-off. So there's a theme, obviously, which many working mothers will completely, I suppose, understand, which is, however, whatever echelon you're in, it's the same. I mean, you are always thinking, am I doing this right? And you look constantly for that one person who can tell you how to do it. I mean, for years I would say to women who had children and jobs, like, how do you do it? Thinking that there was this Rosetta Stone, that somebody out there had the answer. Of course, there's no answer. You make it up as you go along. and in the book, it's constant chaos backstage, right? It's always chaos because you're balancing the house of cards.
Well, the last thing I want to talk about is, the thing that this book demonstrates yet again. I think for people who know you as, a world-class editor, they probably don't think of you as also a fantastic reporter and a wonderful writer. For those of us who've read the Diana Chronicles, we know both those things are evident in that book. And I just want to read a few things that you wrote in the moment in the mid-'80s that are just beautiful observations that I could never have done after going to, the fifth black tie party event of the evening.
I didn't drink, which was very, very useful.
That is clearly very useful. You describe a woman with the wind tunnel look of a recent facelift. Creamy TV anchor Diane Sawyer, which is the most perfect description of Diane Sawyer. Is Rudy Giuliani a latter-day Elliot Ness or just a media-hungry careerist? Boris Johnson is an epic shit.
And he still is.
Yes, you would hope that it would end it badly, but it didn't, or it might have ended badly for all the rest of us.
Unfortunately.
And then, of course, the person whose name we might not have to mention, but is part of our everyday lives. You talked about, you excerpted the Art of the Deal, and you said, it has a crassness I like. Okay, this is in 1987. There is something authentic about Trump's bullshit. Anyway, it feels when you finished it as if you've been nose to nose for 4 hours with an entertaining con man, and I suspect the American public will like nothing better.
Alas, that was true. So yes, well, Trump flits through this book in like a sort of comedic character who gets less and less funny as time goes by, because when we started to really cover him in depth, we uncovered a great many things that he didn't like about his financial predicament and his bankruptcies and all of that, and then his very volatile period of his divorce and so on. And in fact, Marie Brenner, covered him in ways that he didn't like at all, to such an extent that at a black tie benefit that she sat at 6 months after her piece appeared, in which she had described his brother, saying that he was he was the kid who threw cake at the birthday party, which was sort of perfect, and that he had Hitler's speeches in his office, which really made a lot of news. And at that dinner, she was sitting there having dinner, and she suddenly felt something cold going down her back, and she looked behind, and she thought it was something from the waiter that he'd spilled. And then she saw Donald Trump, fleeing off across the dining room, having emptied wine down her back, which he later said he'd emptied a bottle, of course, not a glass, because that is the way Donald Trump is. But it was pretty amazing behavior.
I think some of your observations of many people are, sort of reveal the adage that when you become an adult, you are who you are. And when you turn 50 or 60 or 70, you're probably not going to change.
Probably not.
So I think that the book is, I know we want to have questions. The book is really a riot. I recommend it to people because it takes you away to a different time and place, and sometimes we all need to be taken away to a different time and place. And when you look at the photos, you will remember all those photos from Vanity Fair, and you'll think, wow, that was really iconic. So I think we are going to do Q&A.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I love all the magazines that you've rescued from dire straits. Would you please tell us a bit more about the New Yorker? What attitudes, what new changes you brought? Because I know that you were not supposed to be the great savior, but you obviously were. So what was your philosophy with that?
Well, when I went to the New Yorker, again, I felt very much that I, first of all, had to study its DNA. And when I was first offered the job, I didn't actually think that necessarily I'd be right for it until I went to the Strand bookshop, bought a whole bunch of the old copies of the New Yorker in the 20s and 30s. And as I turned through Harold Ross's New Yorker, the first editor, the founding editor, it really spoke to me. It was a very different magazine, actually, from the one that had been edited later in the last 30 years by William Shawn, which was a much more statuesque magazine, a much more, a bit more of a word church, shall we say. And Harold Ross's New Yorker had a kind of spirit and a vivacity to it. The pieces were short and long. He used visuals, really in a very dramatic way. I mean, there were full-page cartoons of Peter Arno, full-page pages of Charles Adams. Covers were much more sort of newsy and arresting. And I thought, wow, there is a different New Yorker, and that's the New Yorker that I want to do. And actually, I took much of the rubrics and the typefaces and so on from that first New Yorker and restored them into the magazine when I went. So first of all, I felt it needed a strong update in its design without losing the beauty of its pristine Caslon typeface and its kind of lovely sort of, understatedness. I actually, incorporated those old rubrics. I made some full-page visuals like Harold Ross did. I introduced photography in a very limited way. I hired Richard Avedon to be our first staff photographer and gave Avedon full pages of his beautiful black and white, very pristine pictures. And I hired a new cover editor to bring in a whole raft of new cover illustrators and make the covers more relevant and more sort of controversial in many ways. I also had a new cartoon editor, Bob Mankoff, who was originally a cartoonist, and I made him the cartoon editor. It was very funny because when I arrived, actually, in my first day at the New Yorker, there was all men looking at me again, just like this, and I had to give a speech about what I was going to do. They all thought that I was going to bring Demi Moore into the New Yorker. They thought that I naked pregnant covers by Annie Leibovitz, and I was going to fire all the cartoonists. But of course, I did the opposite. I actually gave them their own cartoon issue. And there was one guy who was just glaring at me. He had this long hair, and he looked like Frank Zappa, and he was like miserable face, and he hated me, and he asked all the negative questions, and he was really sour. That was Bob Mankoff, who I made the cartoon editor, right? So they got me wrong in that sense. But, cartoonists are a miserable bunch, let's face it. I mean, that's why it makes them funny. And I had all these, I had a whole bunch of wonderful writers. I let 70 writers go, and I had 50. And amongst the 50 were Remnick, who, was writing for the Washington Post. Of course, now my successor, Jeffrey Toobin, Anthony Lane, Rick Hertzberg, Jane Mayer, Connie Bruck. On and on, some really great writers, and they're all doing wonderful work to this day, I must say.
I really like your attitude, the high-low philosophy. I have a little different question. Am I speaking into it? Okay,
Yeah.
a little bit. I've been trying to agitate among the reporters and editors of the Washington Post who seem to have a kind of a news blackout about Islamic activities in Europe, except for outright terrorism. Do you think there's anything like that going on? You can't hear things. A lot of things I read on something called Gatestone Institute about mass gang rapes in England and car burnings in France and in general across Europe. We never read anything about any
Really?
of that.
You mean they're not writing about some of the mayhem, you mean?
Exactly.
Interesting.
Nothing at all.
I didn't know that. It's very interesting if they're not. One of the problems with Trump has been that he's been so terribly negative about Muslims and with the Muslim ban. I think there's almost an instinct of journalists feeling they don't want to add to that pylon, which of course can sometimes be, I'm sure, overcorrected, and it might mean they avoid writing about some stories that need to be covered. But I definitely think there is perhaps an instinct, which I understand and really share, which is that you just don't want to keep showing Muslims only in a negative light. And that may be one of the reasons why there is some, reticence to cover these stories.
I'd push back.
Can I follow up just a bit?
Yeah.
I think I agree with you that if Trump is doing anything right with regard to that, he gives it a bad name because of his personality overall. But I also think there's a conflation between criticizing all Muslims and criticizing the religion and the tenets. The Washington Post had an Outlook section on Sunday in which a Muslim at Brookings Institution, who would be classified as moderate, talked about ISIS as an originalist version of Islam, as if they represent what Islam was at the beginning. I'm not sure he realized what he was saying, but I just throw that in.
I don't know. I think you need to take this up with the Washington Post, but...
Yeah, I think so too. I would just say, as someone who obviously consumes a lot of media and someone who is from London, I actually think it's the other way. I think we never actually hear about... I'll speak for London, Muslims in London who are 6% of the population of London and who are, very active in every sphere of life in the city.
Including the mayor, who's...
Yeah, obviously the mayor, but they're great writers, they're great actors, journalists. It's a very rich and vibrant community in London, and I think that we just don't hear a lot about that. There's one over here. Oh. Okay.
You talk about replicating the success of Vanity Fair in the US back in the UK. Do you think there would ever be an appetite for a New Yorker-type magazine in London? Could that ever work?
Possibly. Of course, the newspapers and the literary sections of those newspapers are much richer and much more multiple than they are here, because there's obviously many more outlets. But I'm just not sure anymore what magazine can be made to work that's new anywhere, because the question is the advertising. It's like, are you going to get any advertising for it? I mean, actually, they started a very good magazine. I thought The Economist started Intelligent Life, which I loved. I thought it was very good. And, it's already, I don't know if it hasn't folded, but it's become something quite different. And, it has been sort of, its original concept, which was a kind of New Yorker magazine, has been abandoned. So I wish I could say yes. I'd like to say yes, but I think probably not.
Hi, I actually spent years working here as a journalist, actually at NPR, so hi, Madalika. But now I run a magazine in Ethiopia, and where we cover economic development. And either of you can answer this, but I'm curious as to both of you coming from the UK to run US news organizations, US newsrooms, what was that change like, and how did you adapt to sort of keeping your finger on the pulse of a culture that's quite different? And then also, journalism is very male-dominated in Ethiopia, and so I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to make a more the environment more conducive to developing female talent.
Forget
whatever that might be.
Ethiopia. How about Washington and New
Right.
York? I mean, it's like, well, Madalika, why don't you talk about running a newsroom?
I think that I agree with Tina. It's a lot more staid here. I think when you grow up in a culture of multiple newspapers with very different points of view, you take that as a given. And I don't think that, the Telegraph we used to call the Tory graph. If you read the Telegraph and the Guardian, when you read the reporters, you didn't necessarily think that it was partisan in the way that you see Fox or MSNBC. And that, to me, was, I think, one of the hardest adjustments. American journalism loves to talk about objectivity. Personally, I don't believe anyone is objective. We all come with who we are. That's what we bring to our jobs. Fairness is what matters. So those are the things that I think I had to work on in adapting to things here.
For me, it was much more of a sort of sensibility thing. I think actually being an outsider made me sometimes more wired and curious than someone who comes from inside. You know how it is, it's like when you're a traveler and you notice everything. And sometimes I would be stunned by like, oh my God, this late night TV thing, it's just so odd, whatever. And so in a way you sort of thought about things like an outsider, which I think was very helpful in some ways as an editor. I did find America was more, shall we say, sensitive in its feelings. I mean, I think, again, what Madalika was saying, I mean, it's a much more raucous literary culture in the UK. It's a much more knockabout scene. I mean, people are much more iconoclastic and they're used to having takedowns done and so on. It's become very vicious these days. I mean, there is a verb now which, people say to monster, which means to monster somebody, their reputation, in short. But America is much more staid, as you said, in that way. I mean, there's a reason that Spy magazine didn't last. I think that it couldn't last because people got so furious when they were made fun of.
And Private Eye survives.
And Private Eye survives. Private Eye is an icon and is far more actually iconoclastic, really, even than Spy. And It's been in the culture for 50 years now, amazingly.
And on the women front, I don't know what to tell you because we're struggling here, to be honest.
We've already had a whole venting about that before we sat down, so
it's
sorry
really,
not to include you, but
it is interesting. I mean, every single major news organization in the country is run by a male. The only non-white male is Dean Baquet from the New York Times. And if you had said to me 20 years ago that this is what it would look like in 2017, I would tell you you're crazy. We're really making advances. In some ways, I think we've sort of gone backwards. So I'm very excited that the Vanity Fair decided to pick a woman again, 25 years after Tina, and a woman of color as well.
No, that's wonderful. I was so struck when I saw the Hollywood Reporter cover which said the future of CNN, and it was 5 men. I thought, it's really amazing to me that nobody said, there's something wrong with this picture. Somebody's missing here. It didn't even occur to anyone that picture within the CNN culture, actually, that would have said, well, this doesn't look right. But there we are.
You became a parent when you had achieved a remarkable amount, and obviously when one becomes a parent, you start to think a lot about how you want to raise your own children. So you think about your own childhood and how it equipped or prepared you or hindered you in becoming the person that you are. So I was wondering, looking back to your own childhood, if you saw any patterns or any qualities that you felt helped you be the person that you became at a very particular time.
Well, certainly the absolute closeness of my family. I mean, my mother was my best friend, and we were very, very close as a family. And my father was such a kind of believer in me as well. I'm very lucky in that I had that kind of family. It was very important to me. And my parents were very important to me all the way through. And in fact, I couldn't have done The New Yorker, which I write about in the end of the book, unless my mother had said she would come to New York and live with us, with my father. And we rented the apartment across the landing, and they lived in there. And when my children came home from school, they would always go into their grandparents. And it was a wonderful little commune going, which I think is a fabulous way to raise a child. And I was very lucky. Many people can't have their parents living near, but it is a wonderful thing to have grandparents in your children's lives. And it really helped me to be confident, be able to go to work and know that even if I had to be late for half an hour, they were in with my mum, who would be, I'd arrive home and there she was sort of playing with them in the most wonderful way. So that was very, very important to me. And, I hope I can play that role in my children's lives. My son has Asperger's, but he's turned out very well. He's gay, so he's not going to be, I'm not going to get grandchildren there, I don't think, but my daughter is 26 and we're very close, and I'm dreaming that one day I will have, she'll have children and I'll be able to help her in the way that my mother helped me.
Yeah, a few minutes ago, you mentioned Fox and MSNBC in the same sentence as sort of a balance, and I was wondering, I'd really be interested to hear your perception if you think there is an equivalency in terms of a balance between those two medias.
I think Fox has gone really over the edge recently. It seems to now be Trump TV in a way that I don't even think, even a couple of years ago, it was quite that bad. It was always had its own strong point of view and never really pretended to have anything but at least it paid lip service to some kind of a, the fair and balanced thing was Roger Ailes' demonic joke, really. But still, he was careful to keep it sort of, he had a few things he could point to kind of, and at least in the news coverage. Now it's become something so over the top that, and the divisiveness is intense. People seem to want very much only now to be in their silos, which is a real shame. I love the new Brian Williams show, actually, on MSNBC. I think that's a terrific show because I feel that show has a kind of muscularness to it that is less just partisan shrillness. But it's very difficult. I'm still a huge fan of the BBC, I am, and hate when it's under attack because I do think the BBC is critical, as is NPR. NPR is critical.
I think MSNBC comes at its partisanship based in reporting. And I think that we tend to forget when we look at Fox News, the primetime schedule, particularly with Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, that sort of group is not, and Sean Hannity repeatedly says, I'm not a journalist, I'm a talk show host. But, if you look at news at Fox, Shep Smith is a straight up news guy, but he doesn't command the ink that Sean Hannity does or Bill O'Reilly did. And I think that that's one of the challenges.
So I'm going to cut to the gossip. When are Mika and Joe going to get married? And Harry and Meghan. And as someone who knew Diana and wrote one of the most beautiful books I've ever read about her, what do you think she would feel about her boys and how they're living today and in general? The whole
Mika
monarchy.
and Joe, I think they're going to make sure that engagement goes on as long as they can. Diana would have been so proud, I think, of her boys. They have turned out so well because of her, largely. She gave them a childhood that was a wonderfully loving, real childhood, so that they developed the sort of human interactions that poor Prince Charles, who was sort of raised as a sort of Victorian, isolated prince with a tutor and all that. Diana insisted these boys went to schools that, were as much regular schools as she could find. She used to show them the world. She used to take them on, her visits to hospices and to the homeless and so on, and made them feel real people. So I think she'd be thrilled, and I think Meghan Markle is obviously I think she'd adore it. I think she'd love the fact that, first of all, she adored Harry, and who was her sort of favorite, really, because he was such a scamp. And I think that she'd like the fact that Meghan was so independent and, a glamorous woman who knows how to be a woman of style, but also a woman of substance. She seems like a person who has serious interests. And the fact that she's biracial, I think, Diana would love. I think she was so inclusive. She really would have understood and loved that, I think. Very good. Excellent. Excellent for the British brand. So.
Okay, great. Well, Tina, thank you so much. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
You. Thank you so much.